What's up, fellow nerds? My name is Stephanie, and welcome to For the Love of Nerd. Now, today I wanted to talk a little bit about reading challenges. I don't know if you guys are like me, but I love reading challenges. It really helps me decide what I'm going to read, kind of takes the guesswork out of it a little bit, which is good for me because I'm horrible at making decisions. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the reading challenges that I'm doing this year. I am doing the Goodreads challenge, where you just set yourself a limit of books that you want to read and you try to read that many, and I'm actually doing really well. I think I'm almost there, actually, which is really exciting. But I wanted to talk about a different reading challenge. Now, my sister-in-law last year shared with me a reading challenge from the website called Popsugar, and it gives you a list of different books to read. It gives you a little description, and then you have to pick a book to meet that description. So I did that last year, and it was really interesting and kind of forced me to read different books that I wouldn't normally read. So this year I went looking for it again and found their 2017 list. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm just going to show you the books that I picked. I will link the Popsugar reading challenge down below if you guys want to go check it out. It's not too late. It is a bit of a long list, but you guys are power readers. You could do it. But yeah, I'll show you either the physical book that I have, or I'll hopefully be putting a picture right here. I'll read the description of the book that I was supposed to pick, and then I'll give you a few brief little lines about why I chose it. And if you want to know more about the books, you can always look them up on Goodreads or something like that. I don't want to keep you guys here forever because describing every single book would take forever. First on the list, we have a book recommended by a librarian. Now, I am a bit on the antisocial side, so I tend to not talk to people, and therefore have never been brave enough to go and ask my librarian for a recommendation. But they had a table a while back at our library that had librarian recommendations on it, so I figured that counted, which it's going to count, I don't care. But the book that I chose from there was All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. And it's a very popular book. It's been on my TBR for a long time, and I figured it was time to give it a go. Next up, we have a book that's been on your TBR for way too long. And the book that I chose was Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris. And I apologize if I'm saying that wrong, I probably am. But I actually don't remember how the book came to be on my TBR, so obviously it's been there for a while, so figured it was time to clear it out of here. Next up, we have a book of letters. Now, I chose this book because the first time I read it, I was very young and couldn't really appreciate it, so I wanted to give it another go when I could better appreciate what it was. So I chose The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, which is a book of letters, if you can believe it. Next up, we have Listen to an Audiobook. Now, the book I'm going to show you is not an audiobook because I got my audiobook from the library and I had to return it because I listened to it in like January. But the book that I listened to was The Throne of Fire by Rick Riordan. And I tried to read this a while ago, couldn't really get into it, so I decided to listen to it instead, which actually turned out to be a really good choice because I really enjoyed it. Next on our list is a book by a person of color. Now, obviously there were many books that I could have gone with, but I decided to go with Native Speaker by Chang-Rae Lee. And the reason I decided to read this book was because I read a book last year. Actually, I lied. I listened to it. I listened to a book called On Such a Full Sea by the same author and fell in love with it. So I wanted to give another book of his a go, which I'm going to do. Next up, we have Read a Book with one of the 4 seasons in the title. And I've been listening to a lot of this author's books lately and really enjoying him, so I decided to read Farewell Summer by Ray Bradbury. Next we have Read a Book that has a story within a story. I had a really hard time coming up with one for this, but then I realized that Afterworlds by Scott Westerfeld is actually about a girl who's an author, and then we get to read her book as well. So I got that on audiobook and I listened to that one. Next up, we have Read a Book with Multiple Authors. I've been hearing a lot about this book on BookTube, so I decided to go with Illuminae by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I don't have much to say other than I've been hearing really great things about it and I've been wanting to read it, so I am gonna read it. I don't know what you want from me. Next we have Read an Espionage Thriller. So I decided to go with one of the most basic espionage thrillers that you could possibly go with, I decided to pick up The Spy Who Loved Me by Ian Fleming. And I know that this book doesn't look like much at all, but this is actually from Josh's grandmother, so it has some sentimental value to it, and it was here, and it was an espionage thriller, and it fit the requirement, so I'm gonna read it. Don't discriminate against naked books. Next on the list is read a book with a cat on the cover. And seeing how I actually own a cat, it was surprisingly difficult to find a book with a cat on the cover. And I actually couldn't find one I don't think that I own. So I had to go to my to-reads list on Goodreads and actually scroll down until I found one. So the book I chose for this was Catwoman When in Rome by Jep Loeb. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Probably am doing that again. But yeah, Catwoman has a cat on the cover. Pretty self-explanatory. The next book on the list is to read a book by an author who uses a pseudonym. So I went with one of my very favorite authors in the world. I don't read enough of his books, so I added a lot into this list this year. So I chose The Long Walk by Richard Bachman, who is, as everyone knows, Stephen King. Next on the list is to read a book from a genre that you don't normally reach for. And I don't normally reach for contemporary. It's not a genre that I read a lot. I mean, I guess I enjoy it mostly, but I'm more of a fantasy, sci-fi type of reader. So I chose a book called A Man Called Ove by Frederick Backman, I believe. I'm so sorry. But yeah, it's contemporary, so I don't really read a lot of contemporary, so I decided to give it a go. The next book on our list is to read a book involving travel. So the book that I chose, I read the first one last year, so I decided to read the second book because I know it involves travel, and that book is A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir. And that's all there is to it. I'm very excited about it. The next challenge is to read a book with a subtitle. So I chose a book called Do No Harm, Stories of Life, Death, and Brain Surgery by Henry Marsh. And I'm very interested in all types of things medical. I actually have my nursing degree, which is a story I may tell you guys if you ask nicely. But I'm still very interested in it, so I chose this book because it sounded interesting. And it had a subtitle, which is what I was supposed to be doing. The next book we have is to read a book that was published in 2017. Again, a lot of books I could have chosen, but I decided to go with Firebrand by Kristen Britton. I love the Green Rider series very, very much, and this book just came out. I haven't read it yet because I'm rereading the series. You'll see a few more of her books on this list. But yeah, very excited to read this, very eager to get to it. It's a chunker, but should be good. Next up, we've got read a book that involves a mythical creature. Now, with my love of fantasy, I could have picked many, many books, but I wanted to pick one that I hadn't read before. So I picked Let the Right One In. And I'm sorry, I'm not gonna try to say your name. His first name is John, which is easy, but the rest of it, I'll put it here so you can, I'm not gonna embarrass myself trying to pronounce it, but his name is right here, hopefully. But yeah, it's about vampires, I've heard. So, mythical creature. Next up is to read a book that you've read before that never fails to make you smile. Now, I could have chosen a lot of books for this, but I decided to go with Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, and obviously this is the illustrated version of this book, and I hadn't read it since I got it, and I wanted to read it, so I did, and it was magical, for lack of a better word. The next challenge was to read a book about food. Now, I could have picked an actual book about food, but instead I decided to read Bones and All by Camille D'Angelos. I believe this book is about cannibalism. That's food, right? Next we have read a book that has career advice. And I decided to go with On Writing by Stephen King. The next challenge is to read a book with a non-human perspective. So I went pretty simple on this one and went with a book that's been sitting on my shelf for a while, haven't read it in years, decided to read Bambi by Felix Salten. The next challenge on the list is to read a steampunk novel. Now, steampunk is not a genre I reach for very often, and I didn't even think that I had any on my to-reads list. Turns out I did, and I chose Monstrous Volume 1 Awakening by Marjorie M. Liu. So yeah, this is a graphic novel and I hope I enjoy it. Haven't read anything by her before. Next up, we have a very simple one. We have Read a Book with a Red Spine. So I chose this hunker, Percy Jackson's Greek Heroes by Rick Riordan. I flipped through it when I first got it and liked what I saw, but I haven't read the whole thing yet. So when I saw that it had a red spine, decided to use it for this challenge. Next we have Read a Book Set in the Wilderness. So I picked The Kept by James Scott, because it was the only one that I could really find that was set in the wilderness. Surprisingly, out of all the books that I've read, one of the only ones set in the wilderness. Who knew? Next up, we have Read a Book You Loved as a Child. So I picked Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling. Obviously, I still love this book. It's fantastic. It's my favorite Harry Potter book, but I loved it as a child as well, so it qualifies. The next challenge is to read a book by an author from a country you have never visited. I have never visited Germany, although my siblings have. So I chose A Griffin's Feather by Cornelia Funk, and hopefully it's coming out in English this year because I can't read German. But I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be published. Hopefully soon. I may have to switch to one of her other books, which would be fine because they're all great. Next up, we have Read a Novel with a character's name in the title. So I chose Indian Captive, the story of Mary Jemison, again, can't pronounce things, by Lois Litinsky. Help me, mock me, I don't know how to say words. But yeah, I was just scrolling through my to-reads list and found this book and it happened to fit. So go me! The next book I had to choose was a book set during wartime. So I chose The King's Speech by Mark Logue, because I love the movie The King's Speech, and when I realized there was a book, I felt like a hypocrite and decided that I had to read the book, and it fit one of the criteria, so it worked out perfectly. Next we have Read a Book with an Unreliable Narrator. Now this one is a little interesting because the book that I chose, We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver, I actually decided to stop listening to it because I started it a few days ago and for personal reasons decided I wasn't going to listen to it anymore. So if you guys have another recommendation for books with unreliable narrators, let me know because apparently now I need one. For this next one, I definitely cheated a little bit because the original book didn't have pictures in it, but that's okay. The challenge was to read a book with pictures, and I chose Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling, the illustrated edition, which does have pictures in it, and they're beautiful. But I feel like I'm cheating a little bit, but that's okay because this book is great. Next up, we have Read a Book with a main character whose ethnicity is different than yours. And I chose The Sekhmet Bed by Libby Hawker and L.M. Ironside. And this book is about Egypt, so her ethnicity is very different from mine, and I love Egypt, so I'm excited to read this book. Next we have Read a Book about an interesting woman. So I chose The Green Rider by Kristen Britton, and the main character is a very, very interesting young woman, not quite a woman yet, but very interesting young woman, and I've read this before and I decided to read it again to prepare for Firebrand, so yeah, this is really good. You guys should read it. The next challenge was to read a book that was set in 2 different time periods. Now, I really struggled with this one at first and then realized it was staring me in the face because I actually can't believe I haven't read this book yet, and I chose Outlander by Diana Gabaldon. And if you guys don't know that this book is set in 2 different time periods, where have you been? Next we have Read a Book with a month or day in the title. And I was really struggling with this before I realized that I actually never finished this book in high school like I was supposed to. I chose The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, which works very well, and I'm very thankful that I was able to find it because I was really struggling. Next we have Read a Book set in a hotel. Now originally I was going to read The Shining by Stephen King again, and then decided that I should be reading different books. So I actually went with a very unusual book, and I'm actually going to read this title so that I don't mess it up. It's Heads in Beds, a reckless memoir of hotels, hustles, and so-called hospitality by Jacob Tomsky. So yeah, I don't really know what this is about except that it's set in a hotel and hopefully I'll enjoy it. Next up we have Read a Book by Someone You Admire. So this was very easy. Stephen King, I admire him very, very much. So I decided that I wanted to read the Dark Tower series this year with the movie coming out. So I worked in a lot of the Dark Tower novels into this list. So for someone that I admire, I decided to read The Drawing of the Three, which you guys already know that I have finished and loved. And next up is it's actually perfect because it's read a book that's becoming a movie in 2017, and this book is definitely becoming a movie, and I'm super excited for it. The trailer came out not too long ago, and that is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. I'm very excited to see how this adaptation turns out, especially since this first novel wasn't exactly what I come to expect from Stephen King novels. But yeah, I'm really, really excited about the movie. The next challenge was to read a book that is set around a holiday other than Christmas. And I really had a hard time with this one. I really had to search for this book. But I eventually came across The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. Already said, love Ray Bradbury. His name is very difficult to say correctly. Ray Bradbury. And it was a shorter one too, which was good. The next challenge was to read the first book of a series that you haven't started yet. And there are a lot of things that I could have done. There's a lot of series that I haven't started yet. But I got this for Josh for Christmas, so I decided to go with this. And I'm going to read The Lost Hero by Rick Riordan. Now, this is the physical book that we own, but if you hold on a second, I'm actually going to be listening to it because I got the audiobook from the library. Next, I had to pick a book that I bought on a trip, so I chose The Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King. Like I said, I'm trying to work a lot of the Dark Tower books into this list, so this is another one. Next, I had to pick a book recommended by an author I love, so obviously I went with Stephen King. He actually recommends a lot of different books, but I chose one called A Head Full of Ghosts by, Paul Tremblay. No idea what it's about, just know that Stephen King recommended it, and hopefully that's good enough. We have another Stephen King book coming up. A bestseller from 2016. I chose End of Watch by Stephen King, again, because Stephen King. The next book is a book with a family member title in the actual title, and I chose My Sister Rosa by Justine Labillestière, which is a very difficult name to pronounce, but I actually looked it up, so hopefully I did it correctly. But I found this book from another booktuber, and I'm really excited to read it. It sounds really interesting. Next up, we have read a book that takes place over a character's entire lifespan. So this is a book that I've been meaning to read, and it is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Very short book from what I understand, but very interested to read it. The next challenge was to read a book with an immigrant or refugee in it. So I chose The Mango Bride, and once again, this is a name that I don't want to butcher, so I will put it here. You guys can read it and pronounce it for yourselves. I'm sorry. I'm horrible. Next up, we have read a book with a genre or subgenre that you've never heard of. And the book that I chose is Slate House by David Mitchell. And I believe the subgenre that I saw that it was under was something to do with like internet books. And that's what this is. And I'd never really heard of that before, so it fits. Next, we have read a book with an eccentric character in it. And there are many eccentric characters in Black Veil by Kristen Britton. This is another book from the Green Rider series. This is the fourth, I want to say. I hope I'm not wrong. I believe it's the fourth. But yeah, many eccentric characters in this one, so it fits. Next, we have read a book with over 800 pages. Now, one of my goals this year was to reread the Harry Potter series, if you couldn't tell with how many Harry Potter books were on this list. But it was one of my goals to reread the Harry Potter series. So for this book, I chose Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix by J.K. Rowling. Very good book, again, obviously. The next challenge was to read a book that you got at a used book sale. And I get a lot of books at used book sales. You guys can probably tell with how battered some of my books look. I'm not really a snob when it comes to books. I just want the words on the page. But like I said before, I wanted to incorporate the Dark Tower series into my list. So I chose The Wastelands by Stephen King because I bought it at a bookstore that is a used one. I don't know why I said it like that. Next up, we have read a book that was mentioned in another book. So I chose Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. This is all of her novels, but Sense and Sensibility is in here. And I'm reading it because it was mentioned in Twilight. And don't judge me. I read it when I was in high school. I know better now. Don't judge me. Next up, we have read a book that covers a very difficult subject. So I chose What We Saw by Aaron Hartzler, yes, words. I believe that this book touches on the topic of rape, so if you guys want to read this book, be aware of that, as it's a very difficult subject, but I have not read it yet, so I don't really know how it is. I'm hoping that it deals with the sensitive subject matter very well, but we shall see. I've heard good things about it. And lastly, we have read a book that's based on mythology. So I chose The Son of Neptune by Rick Riordan. I'm just now realizing how many of his books are on this list. That wasn't on purpose, but he's fantastic, so why not? But this is another series that I want to read this year, so this book fit in perfectly. That is going to be it for this video today, guys. Thank you so much for sitting through that long list. You guys should let me know if you are doing this list at all, or if you're doing any other challenges, what those might be, and what book you're most excited for from those lists. If you guys like what you see, please go click that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment. We'll try to interact with you guys in the comments as much as possible. Our Instagram and Twitter are linked down below. Go follow us there. But yeah, as always, guys, may your books be many and your interruptions few. Bye, guys! And we have another Stephen King book coming up. Do it. Do it. Thank you.